The biting wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the sharp sting of winter. Snowflakes danced in the air, swirling under the dim glow of the streetlights, as if the city itself was trapped in a frozen silence. In the midst of this harsh, cold night, Ryan Carter sat alone in his small apartment, stirring a pot of soup as the warmth from the stove pushed back against the bitter chill that seeped through the walls. The only sounds in his home were the rhythmic hum of the microwave and the soft crackle of the radiator, both of which did little to break the suffocating stillness. It had been this way for years, lonely, predictable, and quiet. He no longer sought excitement, no longer needed companionship. He had long since closed himself off from the world, retreating into a life of solitude, his heart shielded by the scars of past battles, both on the field and within himself. Ryan had once been a soldier, a man used to the heat of conflict, the adrenaline of danger, and the bond of brotherhood. But that was before everything fell apart. The war had left him with empty promises and broken connections, the weight of loss too much to bear. Now, in the shadows of his small apartment, his life had become nothing more than a routine, a series of days that bled into one another with no real purpose, no true direction. The city outside was alive with people, but he was detached from it all, a ghost in a place that no longer felt like home. It was on one of these nights, as he stood in the dim kitchen, waiting for his simple dinner to finish heating, that the silence of his apartment was shattered. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the walls, so sudden, so deliberate, they felt like a warning. Ryan froze, his hand stilling on the microwave door. He hadn't expected company, especially not tonight. The wind outside had turned violent, the streets desolate, and his neighbors were hardly the type to visit at such an hour. He hesitated, his mind racing through the possibilities. Could it be a stranger? A knock meant trouble when no one ever knocked at his door. For a moment, doubt crept in, but something inside him stirred. A feeling of unease, something about the rhythm of those knocks. It felt urgent, desperate even. Cautiously, Ryan made his way toward the door. He adjusted his jacket, the fabric rustling against his still form. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. With a silent exhale, he turned the knob and pulled the door open. The cold air rushed in, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Ryan blinked in disbelief, unsure of what he was seeing. A blanket, sodden with snow, lay crumpled at the base of the door. And inside it, wrapped tightly and almost forgotten in the cold, was a small, fragile form. The baby's eyes fluttered open, golden and wide, locking onto his with a quiet but unmistakable plea. The child, no older than a year, had skin that was not the pale hue of a human infant but rather a deep, dusky blue. There was something faintly luminous about the child's skin, as though it carried the last remnants of some dying starlight. Ryan's breath hitched, his instincts telling him to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the tiny, fragile creature. He knelt down, his heart racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was no ordinary baby. There was something otherworldly about it. The small hands, delicate and tipped with claws, trembled against the cold. A chill ran down Ryan's spine, the weight of this moment settling heavy in his chest. What kind of world did this child come from? Before he could gather his thoughts, his eyes were pulled upward. Standing in the swirling snow just beyond the threshold was a woman, tall and slender, her frame slightly hunched as though exhaustion had taken its toll. Her dark hair clung to her face, wet from the melted snow, and her eyes, those piercing golden eyes, met his with a raw desperation, an emotion that cut deeper than any battle Ryan had ever fought. There was something familiar about her eyes, something that spoke of pain and loss, but also of determination. She was not from Earth. Ryan's pulse quickened as the realization sank in. She was Valari, one of the refugees who had fled from the devastating war that had ravaged her people. He'd heard the rumors, the stories of their kind, stranded on Earth with nowhere to go, unwanted and hunted. The Valari were a race of brilliant scholars and warriors who had once ruled the stars. Now, their homeworld was gone, reduced to nothing but ashes. Their fleets had been destroyed, and the survivors scattered across the galaxy, surviving in the shadows, their once great civilization fading into extinction. Ryan swallowed hard, unsure of what to do. The woman's eyes never left his face, as if waiting for him to make the next move. She was gaunt, her face etched with hunger and fear. But there was an undeniable strength about her, a resilience that pushed her forward despite the weight of everything she had lost. Her gaze flickered briefly to the child in his arms, and in that instant, Ryan understood. This woman had done the unthinkable. She had left her baby here, on his doorstep, with the hope that someone, anyone, might take pity. The cold wind howled louder, as if mocking his indecision. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he wondered if it would be easier to just close the door, walk away, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But the baby shifted in his arms, its tiny hand curling into a fist, as if searching for warmth. His gut twisted with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a child. This was a desperate mother's last chance, a final plea for help. With a soft curse under his breath, Ryan stepped back, lifting the child into his arms with surprising tenderness. The baby stilled almost immediately, as though it instinctively recognized the comfort of human touch. As he looked up, he saw the woman still standing there, her body trembling violently in the cold, her gaze locked onto him. Ryan knew what she feared. She thought he was going to shut the door and leave her outside. "Get inside," he said, his voice firm, but not without a hint of softness. The woman flinched, as if expecting him to slam the door in her face at any moment. But something in his tone, in the way he held the baby, made her hesitate for only a moment. Then, she moved forward, her steps slow and cautious. Ryan closed the door behind her, sealing out the storm. Ryan closed the door behind them, but the weight of the moment lingered, thick in the air between him and the woman standing in his entryway. She looked around the small, dimly lit apartment, as if she was taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, but her eyes were always darting back to the door, as though she feared someone would burst through at any moment. The baby in his arms let out a soft whimper, and Ryan adjusted his hold instinctively. His heart was racing, still trying to make sense of everything, but there was no denying the feeling that he had just taken in something he couldn't easily turn away from. Lena, her golden eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, stood motionless by the door, wrapped in an old coat that offered little protection against the freezing air still clinging to her skin. The faint glow from the streetlights outside cast shadows across her face, and Ryan could see the deep lines etched there, lines that spoke of a past full of loss and desperation. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Ryan felt a strange unease ripple through him. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or why she had shown up at his door in the middle of a storm with a baby in tow. His mind raced with questions. Was she truly in danger, or was this some kind of trap? Why had she come to him? There were plenty of people in the city who could help. Why him? He had no ties to anyone anymore. No family, no friends. He was just a solitary figure in the background of a world that had long moved on without him. And yet, as he stood there, staring at her, he couldn't deny the feeling that her arrival had been no accident. Lena finally took a hesitant step forward, glancing down at the baby in his arms. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Ryan thought he saw something like hope in them. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the same uncertainty that had clouded her expression when she first arrived. She was afraid, and Ryan couldn't blame her. He could see the way her hands trembled, her breath shallow and ragged from the cold, the way her gaze flicked nervously to the windows, almost as if she was expecting someone to appear at any moment. Is it safe here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might draw unwanted attention. Ryan opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first. How could he reassure her? He didn't even know if he could reassure himself. He took a step toward her, gently setting the baby down on the couch. The child's small hand curled instinctively into the soft fabric of the blanket, the only sound in the room the quiet rustle of its breath. As he straightened, He looked back at Lena, who was still standing by the door, her posture tense as if she were ready to bolt at any second. There was a part of him that wanted to tell her to leave, to close the door and pretend this never happened. But another part of him, something deeper, urged him to do the right thing. He had been a soldier once, trained to protect, to serve, to make tough decisions. But he was no longer that man. He was just a man who had shut himself off from the world. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. It's safer than out there, he said, his words unsure, as if testing the waters. For now, anyway. Lena didn't respond at first. Her golden eyes, bright and unblinking, studied him carefully. The intensity of her gaze made him shift uncomfortably. It felt as if she were searching for something in him, something that would tell her whether he was truly someone she could trust, or just another stranger in a long line of people who would turn her away. She didn't know him. He didn't know her. They were two strangers thrown together by fate, or perhaps by something else entirely. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his own indecision. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't asked for it. But there was something in the way Lena held herself, guarded, yet vulnerable, that made it impossible for him to turn his back. She wasn't just a woman on the run. She was a mother. And that, for some reason, made everything different. "Look," he began, his voice softer now. "I don't know who you are, or where you came from. But I can't just let you wander out there in that storm." He glanced at the baby, then back at Lena. "It's not safe. For either of you." She flinched at his words, but she didn't retreat. Instead, her shoulders seemed to relax slightly, as though she were allowing herself the smallest shred of hope. For the first time, she took a deep breath, a shaky exhale that spoke volumes. "You don't know me," she murmured, almost to herself. "You don't know anything about me." Ryan nodded slowly. He didn't, but it didn't matter. He had no idea what she had been through or why she was here, but something told him that it wasn't just a random encounter. Something in the way she looked at him made it clear that she had nowhere else to go, and despite his initial wariness, Ryan found himself unable to send her away. "Doesn't matter," Ryan said quietly, his voice steadier now. "You're here, and I'm not going to turn you away." Lena's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. She stepped further into the room, but her movements were slow, careful, as though testing the waters. Still, she didn't sit. She just stood there, her hands clutched tightly to the worn fabric of her coat, her eyes darting back to the baby. The silence between them was thick, charged with uncertainty. But in that silence, something began to shift. Ryan wasn't sure what it was. Maybe the shared understanding that they were both in this together, however brief the connection might be. But it was enough. The tension hadn't dissipated, but there was a small, tentative thread between them, a fragile bridge that neither of them could yet cross fully. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something close. The tension in the house was growing, a quiet pressure that neither of them could escape. It had been several days since Lena and Ryan had shared a silent understanding. But now, as the weather outside grew colder, the sense of danger hanging over them became more palpable. Ryan, once a man accustomed to combat, had started to notice things he hadn't before. The subtle sound of footsteps outside his window at odd hours, the faint shadows that passed by the front door in the dead of night. Someone, or something, was watching them. Ryan's instincts kicked in. He knew the feeling well, the one that told you when you weren't alone, when you were being hunted. Lena noticed it too. Her movements had become more cautious, her eyes scanning every corner, every creak in the floorboards, as if the very walls might betray them. Her golden eyes, those eyes that once held defiance and strength, were now filled with fear, a deep-rooted terror that she tried to hide from Ryan, but couldn't completely conceal. She knew the people who were after her wouldn't stop until they had her and her child. Ryan had heard the stories of Valari refugees, how they were hunted like animals, discarded by the world that had once been their empire. If they were found, there would be no mercy. One night, As the wind howled outside and the snow piled higher against the windows, Ryan decided to investigate. He had to be sure. The shadows outside weren't just figments of his imagination. As he moved cautiously to the front window, Lena's voice stopped him. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darkened with dread. "If they find us, Ryan, we won't survive." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a brief moment Ryan felt the crushing reality of their situation. He had thought about turning them away, pretending he hadn't seen them, but now, that idea felt like a distant, almost cowardly thought. They had no place to go, and neither did he. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. Later that night, as Ryan made his way to the back of the house, the door creaked open without warning. Ryan's heart pounded. Two men, shadows cloaked under the heavy snow, stepped into the yard. He could see them clearly now through the fogged glass of the door. They weren't the police. They weren't even human. They were something far more dangerous. Ryan's training took over as he moved swiftly, positioning himself between the intruders and Lena. He didn't know how they had found them, but it didn't matter now. The air was thick with the sound of muffled breaths and the quick shuffle of feet on the snow. He had no choice but to face them head-on. Lena, sensing the imminent threat, made a decision Ryan hadn't expected. Without a word, she moved from her hiding place and into the fray. Her reflexes were lightning fast, and before Ryan could even react, she had tackled one of the men to the ground with surprising force. Ryan watched in stunned silence as she held her ground, her strength unmatched. She wasn't just running. She was fighting for the life of her child, and for her own survival. But when one of the men made a move toward her, Ryan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, throwing himself into the melee. He was quick, but not quick enough. As the man shoved him back, Ryan felt a sharp pain in his side. It was a graze, but it was enough to make him stagger. Lena, seeing the injury, rushed to his side. Her expression shifted from warrior to caretaker in an instant, a softness creeping into her eyes that Ryan had not expected. She didn't just need him. She cared for him, perhaps more than she was willing to admit. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with concern. But even as she spoke, there was a fierceness in her eyes, a resolve that mirrored the strength she had shown earlier. Ryan, still dazed, managed a small grin. "I'm fine," he lied. But his heart wasn't in it. Lena didn't trust easily. But in that moment, as she helped him to his feet and kept watch over him with an intensity that matched the danger surrounding them, Ryan realized something profound. She wasn't just the desperate fleeing refugee anymore. She had become a part of his world, and he, a part of hers. They were bound by something deeper now, a connection forged in the heat of crisis, in the shared knowledge that they had no one else but each other. As the danger subsided and the night grew quieter, Lena and Ryan shared a look that spoke volumes. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time since they had met, there was a sense of something unspoken between them. Trust. Not fully, not yet, but it was there. A fragile thread connecting them in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. And in that moment, neither of them could deny it. They were in this together. And nothing, not the hunters, not the world, could change that now. The night was their only cover, and it felt like the world was closing in around them. Ryan stood by the door, the heavy weight of their decision settling on his shoulders. The street outside was eerily quiet, but the threat was there, lingering just beyond the walls. Every night, the shadows seemed to draw closer, inching toward the apartment like a storm they could no longer outrun. Lena's face was pale, her golden eyes filled with a combination of fear and resolve. She had known this moment was coming, the inevitable choice between staying hidden and running for their lives. Now, there was no choice but to flee. There was no safety for them here anymore. The people after her had tracked them too closely, and Ryan could feel the pressure mounting in his chest. "Ryan," Lena's voice was low but steady. "We can't stay here. They'll find us." Ryan turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. It had been days since the first signs of danger appeared. They had both been too cautious, hoping against hope that the threat would go away. But it hadn't. It had only grown stronger. The hunters were getting closer, and they both knew that their time was running out. "I know," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We need to move. Tonight." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the decision. They had to leave the city. The streets they knew, the places they had come to rely on, were no longer safe. They had to vanish, slip away into the unknown where the enemy couldn't track them, where Lena and her child could have a chance at surviving. But even the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. Of everything Ryan had built. Of the quiet, solitary life he had worked so hard to maintain. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. About Lena. About Evan. And for reasons he couldn't fully understand yet, it was about him too. Something had changed. Something had shifted between them in the days they'd spent together. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by fate. They were partners now, bound by necessity, yes, but also by something deeper, something unspoken. Ryan packed quickly, his mind working in overdrive as he threw a few belongings into a bag. It wasn't much, just the essentials: food, water, clothing. He had no idea how long they'd be on the run or where they would go, but he knew they couldn't waste any time. The cold winter air bit through the walls of the small apartment, and as he looked up, he saw Lena watching him, her gaze distant. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else. A determination to protect her son, to survive no matter what. "We have to go now," Ryan said, breaking the silence. He could feel the urgency in his own voice. Lena nodded, a single, sharp movement. She didn't speak, but Ryan could see the quiet gratitude in her eyes. She trusted him now, more than she had before. She wasn't just the desperate woman he had met at his door. She was a mother, willing to fight for her child, willing to trust Ryan with her life. They moved quickly through the streets, slipping through alleys and side roads as the world around them seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The streets that had once felt so familiar to Ryan now seemed foreign, dangerous. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, felt like a potential threat. They had to stay hidden, to blend in with the darkness, or they would be found. But as they moved through the city, it became clear that they weren't the only ones who were on the move. A group of men passed by, their faces obscured by hoods, their eyes scanning the area. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he ducked into a nearby alcove, pulling Lena and Evan into the shadowed corner with him. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. His pulse raced, the tension so thick in the air that it felt like it might choke him. But the men didn't see them. They kept walking, their steps growing fainter as they disappeared into the night. Lena let out a quiet breath, her hand gripping Ryan's arm as though afraid to let go. Ryan looked at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, locked in this moment of raw survival. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, but now, with Lena and Evan in his care, he was aware of how much he had to lose. There was no turning back now. As they continued their escape, the terrain grew increasingly treacherous. The familiar cityscape faded into desolate areas where abandoned buildings and empty lots lined the streets. They moved cautiously, avoiding any trace of their presence. The tension between them was palpable, but it had shifted. It was no longer just fear, but a deepening connection. As they crossed the desolate landscape, a silent bond formed between Ryan and Lena. They no longer needed words to communicate. Their trust in each other had been built through shared actions and vulnerable moments. Ryan felt it most when he was protecting Lena and Evan, ensuring their safety. Each rest stop, each quiet moment, deepened the bond between them. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was someone Lena could rely on, and in turn, he found himself depending on her in ways he hadn't anticipated. Over time, he noticed small changes, how her hand would brush against his, or how her gaze softened when it met his. They weren't just two strangers on the run anymore. They were becoming something more, something stronger. Ryan couldn't deny it any longer. He was falling for her. After days of running, hiding from danger, they finally found a moment of relief in the thick forest, away from their pursuers. The night was cold, but the sheltering canopy offered some comfort. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel so heavy with fear. Lena, sitting by a small campfire, allowed herself a moment of peace. She had always been cautious about getting too close to anyone. But now, as they sat together, it was clear that they were no longer just surviving. They were surviving together. Sitting down across from him, Lena finally spoke, her voice quiet but laced with something Ryan hadn't heard before. A sense of hope. "There are places," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Places where we can go. Hidden, secret. They're far away, but we'll be safe there." Ryan listened intently, absorbing every word. He knew this wasn't just a vague hope. This was Lena's plan, the lifeline she had been holding onto for so long. Places where they could disappear, where they wouldn't have to look over their shoulders every waking second. But something gnawed at him, the same feeling that had been with him for days. Even in a place like this, a place that felt safe, they weren't free. Not yet. They would never truly be free until they found somewhere far away enough, away from the threat that had haunted them. And for that, they would have to keep running. "Are we ready to leave again?" Ryan asked, his voice low, filled with a sense of resolve. Lena met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to settle between them. They had made it this far, but they both knew they weren't out of danger. Still, there was something comforting in their shared understanding, a realization that they could keep going, together. "I don't know if we'll ever be ready," Lena replied softly, her eyes drifting to Evan, who was curled up against her side, asleep. "But we can't stop now. Not after everything." Ryan nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their journey was far from over. But as he looked at Lena, her face more relaxed than he'd seen it in days, something shifted inside him. She wasn't just someone he was protecting anymore. She wasn't just an alien refugee, a mother on the run. She had become a part of his life, a part of his heart. And in this moment, he realized just how much she had come to mean to him. More than just survival, more than just safety. It was about something deeper, something real. Lena seemed to sense the change too. Her hand reached out, brushing against his for a brief second. It was a small gesture, but it carried so much weight. It wasn't just gratitude or necessity anymore. It was trust. It was more. She was letting him in. She was letting herself feel. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan didn't feel like a soldier guarding his emotions. He felt like a man who had found something worth fighting for. Something worth holding on to. "We've come this far," Lena said, her voice now firm with determination. "And we'll keep going. Together." Ryan's heart clenched at the words. Together. He hadn't allowed himself to feel what he was feeling, hadn't allowed himself to fully process what this connection between them meant. But here it was, plain as day. The fear that had clouded his thoughts for so long had shifted into something else. Something that was no longer just about keeping them safe, but about building something together. A future. Hope. As he sat there beside her, watching her care for Evan with a tenderness he hadn't seen before, Ryan knew that they had reached a turning point. They weren't just running from danger anymore. They were running towards something, and that something was a chance at a life they could build, not in fear, but in the quiet strength that came from mutual trust and love. The world might still be uncertain, and the danger still felt like it was waiting just around the corner. But for the first time, Ryan felt something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. And that hope wasn't just for survival. It was for something more, something real. And in that moment, it was all they needed. The night had seemed like a rare moment of peace. The stars above were barely visible through the dense clouds, but the air felt clear, free from the constant weight of fear that had hung over them for so long. They had managed to find a small, remote cabin in the woods, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena, Ryan and Evan were able to breathe a little easier. They had settled into a rhythm, one that was built on survival, but also on something more. It was as though the world outside had forgotten them, as if they were finally allowed to exist without being hunted. Lena had begun to relax in the quiet of their new refuge, her posture less tense, her golden eyes no longer scanning the horizon for threats. Even Evan had begun to show signs of normalcy, laughing softly at the simplest things, a fluttering leaf, a flickering flame. For the first time, Ryan allowed himself to believe that they might actually have a chance at a future. They were safe, for now. But just as quickly as that peace settled in, it shattered. Ryan had been on watch that evening, his eyes trained on the trees beyond their cabin when he heard it. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. His heart dropped. He knew that sound well. A vehicle, heavy, military. The kind that followed no rules, that didn't care about boundaries, about what was right or wrong. The kind that would stop at nothing to find their target. He froze for a moment, barely breathing, his mind racing. How had they found them? How had they managed to track them here? But there was no time to wonder. The sound of the engine grew louder, and the unmistakable thump of boots on snow echoed in the distance. Lena appeared at his side, her face ashen with dread. "They're here," she whispered, as if saying the words aloud would make the danger more real. Her voice, usually so strong, was now fragile, trembling. Ryan's gaze snapped to her, and for the briefest moment, they shared an understanding. There was no more running. This was it. The military had found them again. They had pushed too far into hiding, and now, there was nowhere left to go. They could run, but it wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. Ryan's mind worked quickly. "Take Evan. Get to the back. Find a place to hide," he said, his voice low and urgent. Lena hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off," Ryan replied, the decision made before he had even fully realized it. "I'll keep them busy. You need to go." The words barely escaped his lips before Lena was already moving, her feet light on the floor as she grabbed Evan, clutching him tightly to her chest. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a raw determination, a mother's resolve to protect her child at all costs. Ryan didn't watch them go. He couldn't afford to. He moved swiftly, checking the windows, making sure the small area they had taken shelter in was secure. He could hear the footsteps now, getting closer. His heart hammered in his chest, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for them. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Ryan's breath caught in his throat. A figure stepped into the room, followed by two more. They were soldiers, dressed in dark uniforms, their faces obscured by masks. Ryan's hand instinctively reached for the gun tucked at his side. "Ryan Carter," the leader of the group said, his voice cold, mechanical. "We've been looking for you." Ryan didn't respond, his mind racing for an escape. But there was no time for strategy. There was no time to think of a way out. It was now or never. He moved. It was instinct. Years of training, years of combat, everything he had ever learned to survive. He charged at the first soldier, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. The soldier grunted in surprise but didn't go down. Ryan twisted, knocking the soldier's weapon out of his hands. The other two rushed him, but Ryan was faster. He ducked and weaved, moving with a speed and precision that surprised even himself. He wasn't just fighting for his own life now. He was fighting for Lena and Evan. The fight was brutal, chaotic, the kind of close-quarters combat Ryan knew all too well. Each blow he landed on the soldiers felt like it might be his last. Sweat slicked his skin, his breath ragged in his chest. His side, where he had been grazed earlier, burned with pain, but he pushed through it. There was no time to think about pain. As he fought, he kept one ear tuned for the sound of Lena and Evan moving in the back, praying they were safe. Every instinct he had told him to end this quickly, to run, to escape, to save them all. But he couldn't. He had to give them time. He had to protect them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers hesitated, regrouping. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He knew the danger they were in now. There was no more time. But in that moment, the soldiers froze. The silence between them was deafening, and for a split second, Ryan thought he had won. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound of a loud explosion shattered the stillness. The soldiers turned, momentarily distracted by the blast, and in that instant, Ryan made his move. He dove for the gun the soldier had dropped and fired a shot. The impact sent one of the soldiers crashing to the ground, and the others scattered, taking cover. Ryan didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his every step calculated, purposeful. His mind was focused on one thing: protecting Lena and Evan. With the soldiers temporarily thrown off balance, he had a few precious moments. He turned toward the back of the cabin, where Lena and Evan were hiding, knowing he had just bought them the time they needed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no time to dwell on it. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a reason to keep fighting, to keep running. And as long as there was breath in his body, he would fight to keep them safe. After weeks of constant fear, the sound of their boots crunching on foreign soil felt almost surreal. They had traveled across treacherous terrain, evading the military, surviving on scraps and the occasional fleeting moment of peace. But now, after their most recent narrow escape, Ryan, Lena, and Evan finally stood at the edge of a new life. The settlement in front of them was nothing like the cold, hostile world they had just left behind. This place was different, quiet, hidden, and most importantly, safe. It was a remote village tucked away in the heart of an untouched valley, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stand guard over the land. There were no high-tech patrols, no watchful eyes searching for them. It was a place where people could live without the constant threat of being hunted down. Most importantly, it was a sanctuary for those who, like Lena, had nowhere else to go. As they entered the settlement, the warm light spilling from humble homes felt like a beacon of hope, something they hadn't seen in so long. Here, they could breathe, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of fear lifted just a little. Lena looked around, her golden eyes scanning the peaceful surroundings. The air was different here, fresher, cleaner. It felt like a world she had almost forgotten existed, a world that wasn't bent on destroying everything she had ever known. She held Evan tightly against her chest, a small but reassuring smile crossing her face as she looked at Ryan. They had made it. They had finally reached a place where they could stop running. The endless flight from danger, the constant fear for Evan's safety, was over. And as she stood there, she allowed herself to believe, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future. Ryan was quieter than usual, his eyes scanning the village with a soldier's caution, but even he couldn't ignore the sense of peace that seemed to envelop them. They were home now. For all his training, all his past experiences as a soldier, nothing had prepared him for this kind of calm. He had always fought for survival, always pushed forward, not sure of what lay ahead. But here, in this tranquil place, the weight of his own actions started to sink in. He had protected them, yes, but he had also found something worth protecting, something beyond survival, something real. He looked at Lena, her face softened by a relief he could barely comprehend. She wasn't just a mission anymore, and Evan wasn't just the child he had vowed to keep safe. They were his family now. The village's leaders greeted them with quiet warmth, offering food and shelter. But it wasn't until they were settled in a small cabin that the true magnitude of their new beginning hit them. Lena carefully placed Evan on a small cot, tucking him in for the night. As she sat down beside him, she met Ryan's eyes across the room. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a bond that had been forged in fire, built on the trust and love that had blossomed during their months on the run. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were something more, something stronger. As the days passed, they began to build a life in the settlement. Ryan helped with the laborious tasks around the village, hauling wood, clearing paths, making sure the borders were secure, while Lena tended to their small home, caring for Evan and doing her part to help the community. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. They didn't need to look over their shoulders anymore, didn't need to hide in the shadows. They were living. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the flames dancing as they watched the sun dip behind the mountains. Lena and Ryan would speak of what they could only dream of before, of their future, of the family they were creating, of the world they wanted to build. It was no longer about survival. It was about something more, about hope, about love, about a future. And as the seasons changed, so did their lives. The quiet days spent working, talking, and building grew into months. Evan, once so fragile, grew stronger, his laughter ringing through the cabin as he played with the other children in the village. Lena and Ryan exchanged glances across the room, their hearts full in a way they had never known before. They had found home. They had found peace. The final image of their life together, of Lena, Ryan, and Evan standing hand in hand at the edge of their new home, looking out over the valley, was one of contentment, of an unspoken promise that, no matter what the future might bring, they would face it together. They were no longer the hunted, no longer the outcasts. They had found a place where they could simply be. And for the first time, in a world full of uncertainty, they knew they had everything they needed: love, trust, and a future they could shape. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.